The development of 007 First Light is full of noteworthy numbers. The 6.5 years it took in development, for example, once a sign of dev hell, but now reflective of the average AAA lifecycle. The $200 million budget, also astronomical, also very indicative of modern AAA development. But there's one specific number that I want to hone in on. 2,164,500. This is, to the best of my knowledge, considering the growth of the 007 team over time, as well as the standard Danish work hours per year, the total amount of man-hours it took to make this game. It took some of the most talented designers, programmers, animators, writers, producers, and QA testers in the entire world 2,164,500 cumulative hours to create this game. And after all of that time and effort, once it got in the hands of actual players, it had approximately 1 hour to win them over. And it sure as hell did. If you've been paying attention to how video game consumption, or just media consumption in general, has been changing over time, you've probably noticed two things. It's getting real fast and real unforgiving. Attention spans are practically non-existent. The rise of subscriptions has allowed people to sample dozens of experiences without necessarily committing their time to any of them. Completion rates are dropping. The spike in game and console prices has driven more people to streamers and Let's Players, who often drop series that don't receive significant engagement early on. And Steam's rapid growth has normalized the idea of refunding games within the first 2 hours of playtime, which means even though I'm kind of exaggerating when I say that First Light had an hour to prove itself, I'm also kind of not. Now more than ever, the opening of a video game can dictate its virality and its stickiness. Years of work can be made or broken in less time than it takes for some people to download the games in the first place. And while a bad first showing can always be overcome, we've seen games as recent as Crimson Desert muscle through middling openings to become massive commercial successes, I don't think that's a gamble that most studios want to take, especially as the games ecosystem continues to become more digital and more transient than ever before. All of which means, whether you're putting out a story-focused single-player game or a 300-person battle royale, you need to hook people in about 60 minutes. So how do you do that? I think the easiest way to pin down the qualities of a good opening is to look at some of the best and worst opening hours of the last few years and see what they do well or poorly, starting with one of my favorite examples of setting the tone early. Helldivers 2. The opening cutscene of Helldivers 2 runs for about 1.5 minutes, and it's essentially a trailer for the game to come. In fact, most of it basically was the announcement trailer, and to me, it's such a perfect 90 seconds to start the game with. You immediately get a sense for what the entire shtick is gonna be: ultra-space patriotism with heavy-handed in-game propaganda. You see this guy walking down the street, waving at the friendly officers decked out in millions of dollars of military gear just strolling around the suburbs. He looks over at his loving wife and son, and then watches them get ripped apart by a giant bug. Has this ever happened to you? To stop it from happening again, come join the Helldivers and spread managed democracy. The rest of the scene maintains that over-the-top tone while also highlighting what you'll actually be doing in the game. It shows off the patented co-op Brothers in Arms gameplay loop, it sets up the very specific manner of speaking that appears in the in-game mission logs, debriefs, and even out-of-game marketing, and it keeps hammering home that initial idea of ultra-patriotism. It's essentially an elevator pitch to the audience while also establishing the tone and flexing its production qualities. It's a great first impression, after which it transitions into what I think is an equally well put together tutorial. I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of a good tutorial that flows well and accomplishes multiple tasks at once. It's not on its own something that can make or break an experience, but again, the earlier you can convince people of the quality of an experience, the better chance you have of keeping people around for the long haul. In Helldivers' case, they do kind of stick with the default tutorial setup for military adjacent shooters by putting you inside of a simulated combat environment with a drill sergeant barking in your ear. But instead of putting you inside static shooting galleries devoid of any personality, the area is a lot more open, the tasks more physical, the person giving you orders more over the top. He's got these like J. Jonah Jamesonisms, and the scenarios you face in the tutorial are a lot more reflective of how things are actually going to work in the outside world, as you duck under heavy turret fire and handle large swarms of bugs. It's explosive, tonally consistent with the opening, a little bit tongue-in-cheek with its cardboard cutout placeholders, and then it's done. In under 10 minutes, you're in the core gameplay experience and the kid gloves are mostly off. Helldivers 2's opening is effective because it's efficient and has absolutely no reservations of the kind of experience it is. The opening doesn't really work if the rest of the game's writing, marketing, art style, weapon types, even its animations weren't all telling an extremely consistent story, which is a huge testament to how great the game direction is. But those exact features are so well condensed at the beginning that somebody who's played 20 minutes of Helldivers 2 could do basically as good a job of explaining its premise and core appeal as somebody like me who's played dozens of hours of it. That said, one advantage Helldivers does have is its overall vibe is so bombastic and in your face that laying it out in front of the player in an extremely obvious way is totally admissible. But just because a concept is a little more understated doesn't mean it can't be conveyed equally efficiently. For example, let's look at another sci-fi third-person shooter that has a totally different vibe. Returnal. Actually, hold on a second. Now I know this whole video is about hooking players right away, but the other half of that equation is keeping them hooked, maintaining that high level of quality throughout the entire experience. And if there's any game out there that embodies the idea of being almost stupidly well put together and addicting, it has to be Terraria. And wouldn't you know it, the good people over at Lost in Cult are putting out a design work so you can learn firsthand how a single person created one of the most successful games of all time. If you're not familiar with Lost in Cult and their design works, they're a series of high quality deep dive books on some of the best games out there. My copy of the Alan Wake design work should be shipping pretty soon, and I've literally been counting the days until this thing gets here. I'm so stoked. Terraria's design work is no different. It's based on in-depth interviews with Andrew Spinks, the original solo creator of Terraria, as well as the rest of the team that's worked to keep it alive the last 15 years. It takes you all the way from the game's origins to the weapons, biomes, and monsters that it features, to how now it simply refuses to die. All as part of this beautifully illustrated book. As always with Lost in Cult's design works, there's a special deluxe edition that's available exclusively during the pre-order period that ends on July 31st. That edition comes with the softcover design book that features the iconic Eye of Cthulhu in hollow foil, and that's wrapped up in this nice hard shell slipcase. On top of that, you get a Bestiary Blitz card game, a bespoke papercraft kit, 5 pin badges, a pixel art poster, a hollow bookmark, and 9 postcards featuring some of the game's most beloved biomes, all inside of this premium presentation box. Again, the deluxe edition is available until July 31st, but if you're watching after then or just want the design book by itself, the standard edition will still be available for purchase. And if you use the code USADTerraria at lostincult.co.uk or just click the link in the description, you can get 10% off site-wide. Thanks again to Lost in Cult for sponsoring this video. Now let's talk some Returnal. Returnal starts on an establishing shot of a lone spaceship with a single passenger flying into an unknown planet. As it enters orbit, the ship's terminal warns that the approach is forbidden, and shortly after it gets struck by lightning, crash lands, and the pilot, Celine, ends up in an area that will become all too familiar to you over the next 20 to 30 hours. Unlike Helldivers' immediate on-the-nose narration, Returnal at first doesn't explain anything about anything. Who are you? What is this planet? Why are you here? Why is it forbidden? All of these questions are key parts of Returnal's mystery, and so it lets those questions linger in the background. But it also understands the importance of giving the player things to latch onto early on so they actually care about the mystery instead of losing interest in something they have absolutely no attachment to. And so it starts things off really selling you on its isolation. The establishing shots position you as tiny and insignificant in the face of this massive alien planet of Atropos, and upon crashing, Celine tries to communicate with what you assume is a home base of sorts, only to be met with silence. As you leave the crash site and begin exploring this strange world of giant statues and hieroglyphics and foliage that literally reaches out to cling onto your body, you continue sharing comms and continue to hear nothing back. A few short moments later, you stumble onto a body, which seems to be the first real sign of life on this planet, except it's actually dead, and it's also you. As you pick up the sidearm that was left behind and brush up against hostile creatures, you come across an audio log, what you assume is finally some form of contact with another person, only to again be met with your own voice.
Scout log. Atropos. Elapsed time 30 minutes since last crash.
It's a recording that you don't remember about some kind of infinite loop you're trapped in, and as the minutes and hours go by, the game continues to feed you hints on those questions it set up at the beginning. I obviously won't spoil any of it for you, but what I will say is that even when the picture starts to fill in, the game never stops making you feel like you're alone. Answers usually come in the form of old memories and previous loops in your endless cycle, not other people that you're running into. And for a roguelike that takes place in a dark and uninviting planet, that solo character focus and psychological exploration feels like a perfect match. The feeling this game wants to convey is locked in from the first few seconds and never let go, which is really impressive for Housemarque's first big AAA title. And it's also why I'm kinda disappointed that the same can't really be said for the game's pseudo-sequel, Saros. Now I should say, I did enjoy Saros quite a bit overall. Not quite as much as Returnal, but it's just as fun, has a great setting, and continues to be the exact kind of game I think we need more of from AAA developers. That said, it's also a great example of how a messy opening can take a player out of things early on, and how it can make them far less interested in the many hours that follow. Saros begins in the exact opposite way that Returnal does, with an unnamed voice calling out to your character Arjun from afar, and him responding, already establishing some kind of character relationship. On top of this, unlike Celine, to which Atropos seemed completely foreign, you get the impression that Arjun has already been acquainted with the planet Carcosa and understands parts of how it works, given he's not surprised by its many strange creatures and is muttering some nonsense about the sun. And to be clear, in and of itself, this change in direction is not a bad thing. It's just different, and it comes with its own set of problems to solve. For example, the game is immediately putting itself on a bit of a tightrope, because the player knows a lot less about what's going on than the character in the game. This is a trope that can definitely work. In fact, we'll talk about a game here soon that does something very similar, but it requires some surgical precision to pull off. And I wouldn't exactly call the next 30 minutes of Saros surgical. Basically, Arjun dies in a scripted boss fight, and then you're hit with the opening credits and flashes of what are presumably his memories, all of which looks cool and interesting, and from a production standpoint, everything has been great so far. But right after you get past the title drop and pop out of this pool of goo into some room where another character is kneeling in front of another pool of goo, you're hit with a cutscene that I think I need to play in full to really get my point across. I'll cut out some of the dead air, but I need you to understand just how much information is thrown out there in a scene that lasts just 2 minutes.
It was promised!
I need to know that I just made the right decision.
It's me, boss.
Haven't seen Tarn since he sabotaged our ship. Thought he was dead. Just like you.
Wait, how long?
Since the last time the sun died, man.
Yeah, I remember seeing the eclipse and then...
Tarn was good people. You can come out.
Tarn.
Arjun? Tarn. No. What happened?
Where have you been? And what did you do?
Nothing. I don't know what to tell you, Kate. It feels like I only just left and Tarn jumps me.
You left us here. We've lost people. There's no way to get home, and you think
Kayla,
you can just...
he's returned to us. That is what matters.
Time for this later. Kayla, Stack, go make sure Tarn didn't mess with any other equipment, while Jerome and I deal with this.
Now maybe I'm just an idiot, but I can't explain to you how goddamn confused I was watching this. Kind of rough voice acting aside, let's try and run through what just happened here. In 2 minutes, we're introduced to 5 different characters, one of whom is possessed and then dies, and was also said to have sabotaged these characters' ships some unknown time ago, but at least long enough for everyone to think he was dead. But also they all talk about him very fondly despite him sabotaging them, so I guess they can tell he was possessed and also assume he was possessed pre-sabotage, but Arjun seems to not be in the loop on this whole possession thing, and he presumably crashed along with everyone else, so already I'm lost on who knows what and why. You were also presumed dead because you'd been gone since the last time the sun died. So the sun dies on this planet, and these characters have either done the recon or experienced that phenomenon enough times to know it's a recurring thing, but also it's potentially tied to your death, or maybe not. At the time this scene takes place, there's no way of knowing. The characters make a pretty big deal out of your long absence. One in particular treats you like you left them there to die, which made me initially feel like I'd been gone for a very long time. Weeks, months, hell, it might have been years. The crew certainly gives the impression that they've been here for a while and you haven't. But if you actually decide to talk to the crew after this, it turns out you've only been gone for a few days. But then if you talk to another crew member, it feels like you've been lost forever and a bunch of shit has happened since you left. People have gone off and died, others have come back crazy. In the moment, it really doesn't feel like these timelines are matching up at all. And to add to the confusion, the format of that tutorial run, the way that you start it, the distant voice, the fact that you don't seem to remember anything around it, is so different to how the rest of the game operates that I couldn't tell in the moment if it was a dream sequence or a state between life and death or from the future. I still didn't know the exact sequence of events like hours into the experience. It's also super unclear in this moment if the characters know you can resurrect, which seems like an important enough topic for them to talk about before anything else happens, but nope, nobody cares right now. Literally, the instant this scene ends, you're given a mission to go find some colony that's yet to be mentioned and can just leave without talking to anyone if you feel like it. So not only was that whole sequence super confusing, it also seems like no one gave a shit that it happened, at least right now. And you might be thinking at this point, hey man, the game's clearly being mysterious on purpose. You don't know these things because they're supposed to build intrigue and make you want to know more about the world. You know, like the thing you said you liked about Returnal. But my counter to that would be that while I'm fine not knowing about the mysteries of this world yet, I'm not sure I should be so confused about what I should be confused about. There's so many random, tangential, offhand sentences and non-committal timelines and quick exposition on what is clearly a complicated backstory of how this crew got here, not to mention questions about how this planet works, that half of it went over my head when I first watched this scene, and the other half just seemed incredibly disjointed and hard to follow for the next few hours. It's not like you can't set up multiple mysteries at the beginning of a story. In fact, that's encouraged. But I feel like the game was caught in between setting up compelling questions and wanting to get the player in the thick of the action quickly. Both good instincts on their own, but they're a little bit antithetical to one another, so you have to be meticulous when trying to pull it off. If you're gonna go for maximum mystery building, most of the questions should either feel extremely connected, where an answer to one will help clear up everything else. This is exactly what Returnal did by centering everything on what this planet was and what we were doing here. Or if you're gonna fly off in a bunch of different directions, each branch should at least get a second to breathe and establish itself. I think of Alan Wake 2 and how it sets up a strange cult, the disappearance of Alan Wake, Saga's backstory, and the uncanny behavior of the town's residents, all in the first 30 minutes. But those questions never step on each other or get established off of a single easy-to-miss line in the middle of like 12 other things happening. Not only does that help me sort out the questions in my head a little bit easier, but I have a chance to feel emotionally invested in each thing. I can't build an emotional interest in a character that I knew for 3 seconds during which he hissed at me. These are random people. I'm not just gonna care because you told me to. I'm not sure how popular of a take this is about Saros, but as somebody who loved Returnal and its storytelling, and really liked Saros as well, I was shockingly ambivalent about learning more about this objectively incredibly put together world. The question of why I should care, why I should want to continue, was carried entirely by the quality of the game feel and the interesting visuals. And that's fine, that's enough, but it really could have been so much more gripping. The confusion of the first few hours absolutely affected my approach to a game that I was otherwise very interested in and excited for. On the opposite end of the spectrum though, the first couple hours of the new James Bond game made me a believer in something that I was initially very skeptical about. If I had to describe what I liked most about First Light's intro in a single word, it'd have to be momentum, which is a little ironic considering this game has by far the longest opening act of anything on this list. You're really not out of the intro / tutorial phase for like 2 hours, arguably more. But each section inside of those 2 hours is tightly packaged, varied, and accomplishes multiple tasks at once. The first mission is all about establishing a pre-spy Bond, who he is and what he's all about. But instead of treating this as an isolated task where we see a rebellious Bond going through an inciting incident as a child or something, we instead follow him already as a naval officer, crash landing on an island mid-mission, being completely stripped of his equipment and support, and in a high-stakes environment. environment. This gives us a chance to witness his survival instincts firsthand, as the game really sells us on his ability to adapt and observe important details.
Fingers are the first to go.
What?
In the cold. First they hurt, then nothing.
Right. Tell me about them.
They're an international group, speaking English but with accents, capable and well organized. Ex-military. Firearms are unfamiliar, I guess. Special issue.
Stigos. Desibiodosan.
Obtusti se. Stižom za sekund.
You speak Serbian?
Montenegrin. Picked up a few phrases while mountain climbing there.
A man of hidden talents.
While this is happening, we're also establishing the existence of MI6 and some of the secrets that will shape the overarching narrative. Plus, we start to build a relationship with a particular radio op, which will become a very core part of the rest of the game. And then to top it all off, about halfway through, we watch as Bond defies direct orders to leave after gathering critical information in order to instead save the MI6 captives on the island. There's a scene that comes soon after this where a character mentions he has
Issues with authority.
and getting to actually witness that before it's ever mentioned really helps solidify his character archetype early, while also establishing his fearlessness and knack for heroics. First Light is one of the best examples of creating a truly dense and efficient opening mission, and then it follows it up with this highly produced, decadent opening credit sequence backed by Lana Del Rey. And that's how you start a goddamn video game. As the credit sequence ends, we move to a few months later and the official offer from MI6 for Bond to become an agent. And then the moment that conversation ends, we're sent right into training. Now here the game easily could have hit a snag, because we're a good chunk of the way in, there's already been a basic tutorial, we're meeting new characters, everything's chugging along, and now Bond needs to stop and learn how to be a spy. And that needs to feel like a real process. You have to showcase how spy work differs from military work, so how do you avoid losing momentum during a second tutorial almost an hour into the game? By having hands down the coolest tutorial I've ever seen. Bond's time at the academy gets turned into a playable training montage where you learn the basics of fighting, driving, stealth, gunplay, parkour, and more as a fast-paced, race-against-the-clock set of increasingly elaborate challenges. It not only does my favorite thing of grounding the tutorial inside of the story that it's telling, but it does it in style while also developing your relationship with two key classmates who are helping you through the process. You get a good sense of their personalities and their strengths as agents, not because the game constantly stops and makes note of it, but because you see how they both approach the training in different ways and take the lead on different tasks. Again, the game is never just setting up one thing at a time. Gameplay and story are always moving in lockstep. You get introduced to new gadgets, you and your friends go home and use them on everything. You train to pass polygraph tests, you use it to trick your friends into revealing secrets. While the intro of this game is pretty long, way longer than you'd expect for a game that only runs for about 15 hours, it deserves a ton of credit for being able to cover so much ground so quickly without ever feeling rushed. It's the perfect harmony of character progression and gameplay progression, and as somebody who's literally never seen a James Bond movie before, it instantly turned me into a James Bond fan. Now at this point we've looked at 4 different openings across a few different styles of game, and I think gotten a good sense of the criteria you mostly want to hit. Setting the tone early, establishing the game's identity, creating diegetic tutorials, building curiosity without creating confusion, emotionally investing the player in the world, concept, and characters, and understanding that these are not sequential tasks. They have to happen somewhat simultaneously. So with that knowledge, the last thing I want to do is directly compare 2 games with these bullet points in mind. Specifically, 2 games that came out almost at the exact same time and share a good deal of the same underlying DNA. They're both fantasy RPGs with slick, magical combat, full of whimsical creatures, and a slew of companions to interact with. But while one game has maybe my favorite video game opening ever, the other one was basically a complete non-starter. And those games are Clair, Obscur, Expedition 33, and Avowed. In order to fairly compare these games though, I do think it's important to acknowledge that they both approach storytelling very differently, and neither approach is at its core worse than the other. They're just different. One is very active in its storytelling, it's dramatic, very movie-like during its big moments, and the other takes a very classic Western RPG approach. It has a silent protagonist that acts as a vessel for the player, and is meant to have a malleable world that you can poke, prod, and nudge in the direction that you want. It's gameplay-driven storytelling. So what I want to avoid is is comparing them in a way that doesn't actually give us tangible things Avowed could have fixed without just becoming a whole other game. It doesn't really make sense to focus on production value, for instance. Instead, I want to compare them in terms of how they sequence important events, convey crucial information, and establish emotional connections. Clair Obscur begins with a few establishing shots that are designed to make you curious about what's going on in this world. The first image you see is of a broken and splintered city resembling Paris, featuring an Eiffel Tower that's basically running away from itself, followed by a shot of some monolithic structure in the distance with the number 34 on it. As questions about what exactly is going on here sit at the back of the player's mind, we move on to a short conversation between two of the game's main characters, Gustave and Maëlle. And this conversation hinges on quite a few things that the player isn't familiar with yet. A girl named Sophie, some kind of festival, an expedition that people apparently give their lives for. But to harken back really quick to the Saros conversation, the reason in my opinion this doesn't just devolve into pure confusion is because these things are all clearly related. The way they're talked about is easy to follow and delivered by characters who make it clear what they understand. So while we as an audience aren't quite on the same page as them yet, it's obvious that we're about to be. And lo and behold, just a few minutes later, Gustave actually meets up with Sophie and they go to the festival together. The interaction between the two of them is endearingly awkward and charming, but also very wistful, as you get a sense that there's some complicated history here. One full of love and affection, but also maybe some regret or missed opportunities. The next 10 to 15 minutes show the couple exploring the city of Lumiere and taking part of some of the festival's activities. And while everything you see and experience is beautiful, it's also tinted with that same sad feeling that was present during their conversation. There are plenty of allusions to a coming tragedy, as Sophie specifically seems to garner the sympathy of both Gustave and the other festival goers. She's said to only be 34 years of age, and yet everyone speaks to her like her life is over, and she insists that she's at peace with whatever's about to happen. Once again, tone is so important. This game begins with a resplendent celebration of art and song and declarations of hope, but there's a very clear tension beneath it, an inevitable feeling of dread, and that same balancing act is maintained throughout the rest of the game. As the two finally make it to the pier at the edge of the city, we witness a hard shift, as the undertones of the last half hour move up to the surface. The energy curdles, and we watch as the imposing monolith from earlier, the one seen sporting the number 34, gets repainted by some creature to now read 33. And with that change, nearly everyone on the pier begins to vanish. Friends, lovers, parents, and finally, Sophie, as Gustave comforts her in her final moments and she fades away in his arms. It's honestly unbelievable the sheer amount of feeling this opening has. The rest of the intro is then spent understanding a little bit more about the monolith and the paintress, as well as establishing how the city launches an expedition each year to try and stop her. But basically the entire lore breakdown happens after we're already emotionally invested. Putting the player in the shoes of somebody who literally just lost a loved one because of all of this is a perfect way to align the player with the character's goals. And that emotional alignment continues throughout the next hour, which is arguably even stronger and more emotionally dense than the opening, as impossible as that sounds. But in the interest of not just having half this video be about Clair Obscur, I think it's probably good to leave it here and instead move on to the opening of Avowed. Avowed starts with a 2-minute animated sequence narrating the backstory of the world of Eora. In fairness to the game, it does take place in an existing universe from a different Obsidian RPG, so I guess they just wanted to catch people up to speed. But still, this is a pretty stark contrast when it comes to show versus tell, and it's made even worse because half of it isn't even like world setup, it's your own backstory. The fact that you're half god, you were bullied for being different, but then the Emperor saw potential in you and sent you out as his envoy. All of which is totally stuff that you could just convey with actual in-game interactions. I mean, the game basically does this anyways, but because it already told you all of this stuff at the beginning, you're sort of just waiting for the people you meet to realize things you already know about yourself. Like a good 70% of the conversations in this game start with, "Oh dude, your face is so messed up. What are you, like half god or something?" Oh, ain't no way. Unless... Anyways, after the leading narration, you get to build your character, and then we launch into another narration, as you hear about the corruption of the living lands and how your goal is to figure out whatever's causing it and stop it from spreading. Again, totally stuff that we could experience ourselves, or some that you could tease to build up curiosity, like those opening shots of Clair Obscur. But no, somebody has to literally explain to you exactly what's happening. On the way to the pier, your ship crashes and you wash up on shore in some isolated part of the world. And here you run into a couple of characters whose main purpose is to give you a little bit more exposition and to guide you through this tutorial area before disappearing 20 minutes later and basically never showing up again. The whole concept of this tutorial is pretty goofy to me because it just ends with you on the pier that you were trying to get to at the beginning anyways, and has no bearing on the rest of the narrative to my knowledge. It's very clearly just like a lazy excuse to teach you how to fight without plopping you directly into the open world. And also to show how some species here don't like other species, which you know because the characters are like, I don't like your species. It's all just extremely generic and impersonal. Again, I don't expect a game like Avowed to have the raw narrative quality of something like Clair Obscur, because it's not meant to be as tightly authored of a narrative. But for it to not even attempt to give you an engaging opening scene to build up your curiosity, for each character to show up in such perfunctory ways, for it to have such a generic problem of a nondescript crazy juice making people crazy, and then when you see those crazy people, they are aggressive and say crazy stuff, all the while staring at the camera and telling me exactly why all of this is happening and why I should allegedly care, it just comes off as thrown together. And this is still the case if you compare it to other Western RPGs. Skyrim starts you on your way to an execution that gets interrupted by a dragon. Oblivion's opening narration is significantly shorter, punchier, and has a real hook.
These are the closing days of the Third Era, and the final hours of my life.
And plus you actually physically meet the Emperor and have an interesting interaction with him. Even Obsidian's own last RPG before Avowed, Outer Worlds, shows a mad scientist shooting your character at a planet where they basically worship corporations, and the first person you meet is shilling them while on the verge of death. There's just so much more personality here. I've said it before, but playing Avowed really feels like reading the Wikipedia page for fantasy. And its first hour is, in my opinion, one of the best examples of how to phone in an opening. While it would be hyperbolic to say that the first hour or two of a video game were completely make or break, it's not at all far-fetched to say that they're the most important hours in what is now becoming a 5 to 10 year process. Unless you're in a very rare echelon of developers, by which I basically mean Rockstar and a handful of Sony and Nintendo first-party studios, you really can't afford to throw a weak first punch. Even if you're aiming for a slow burn, you need to build up that curiosity, that emotional connection, that sense of confidence in your concept, because nowadays, if players don't believe in your game after the first hour, they'll never touch the next 20. If you didn't catch the Wii video that I put out last month, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's one of my favorite videos that I've put together. Thanks again to Lost in Cult for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can use my code USADTerraria to get 10% off site-wide. Subscribe if you're new, join the Discord, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.